turn around and prove to me I'm right." His voice shattered the silence. Even though his words eventually faded, they echoed in my mind. I had never heard Michael, my stepfather, speak in such a manner. I pretended not to register his tone, yet his stare seared into my back. He had always been poised, successful, a man I believed I knew, but that night, I witnessed a side of him I never anticipated. It all started a few weeks back, when his focus on me became peculiarly intense. Initially, his gestures appeared considerate, small, thoughtful presents, spontaneous invitations, sincere compliments. However, I soon detected nuances that went beyond ordinary care. His looks lingered a bit too long, and his inflection carried a calculated sharpness. I began quietly scrutinizing his actions. One afternoon, while I was working on my homework, I discovered a neatly wrapped gift on my desk, a present I hadn't requested. The item was a delicate piece of jewelry, something intimate rather than generic. Every act seemed premeditated, as if he were orchestrating a scenario far exceeding simple affection. That critical night when we were alone at home, I chose to wear a short dress he had gifted me, a present that now held a dual implication. The living room was dim and hushed. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock. I sensed his gaze on me, and every noise felt amplified in the dense quiet. Michael advanced closer, his presence both imposing and unsettling. Without a moment's hesitation, he repeated, "Turn around and prove to me I'm right." His tone brooked no defiance. I felt a shudder as his command cut through the stillness. I maintained a composed expression and offered a slight, knowing smile. I understood the direction this was taking, so I resolved to wait until he lost his composure. At that moment, I decided not to react impulsively. I observed every detail, each subtle twitch in his expression, every fleeting glimmer in his eyes, and measured my response meticulously. His actions were not simply about affection, they were a demonstration of authority and control. I began to notice his presence in everyday moments. At breakfast, he hung around the table longer than usual, his eyes seemingly scrutinizing my every move. On family outings, he invented reasons to stay close, delivering compliments that felt more rehearsed than genuine. Every encounter left me with a mounting sense of disquiet, yet I maintained my poise. I mentally catalogued each incident, every unusual behavior, determined to unravel his true motives. This careful monitoring became my defense, and while my mind teemed with questions, I remained outwardly serene. I could feel the gravity of these moments converging toward the inevitable climax of that night. I recalled an incident from the previous week. During a quiet dinner, he leaned in and said, "You have no idea how special you are." His voice was low, meant only for me, and it unsettled me. I smiled outwardly while internally noting every word. That smile was not submission, but a mask for my resolve. I decided early on not to let him control the situation. I would watch and wait for the moment when his fade would crack. As the night wore on, the room felt increasingly confined. Every second carried unspoken tension, and I sat still, silently promising myself that I would not be manipulated. The command, "Turn around and show me that I'm not mistaken," echoed in my mind as a warning. I knew the evening was the start of a dangerous game. Every gift, every whispered compliment, every lingering glance was a step toward a confrontation I had been preparing for. I resolved to be patient, to wait for him to lose control, and then to take back my power. I am aware that this situation is escalating. Michael's behavior is more than care, it is an attempt to dominate and control. Tonight, I saw a side of him I will not forget. As I sat in the dress he gave me, I maintained my resolve. I smiled while calculating my next move, letting the tension build until the moment was right. I knew exactly where this was going, and I decided to wait until he lost control. The next day, Michael invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant. I accepted his invitation even though my mother had asked why I should go instead of her. "We rarely spend time together," she had said. "With Courtney," he explained, as if that were a simple routine. I knew the real reason lay in his recent behavior, and I was determined to observe every detail. At the restaurant, the atmosphere was calm and controlled. Michael greeted me with a measured smile and led me to a private table. I noticed he ordered an expensive bottle of wine without hesitation. The waiter brought it promptly, and Michael poured us both a glass. As we sat down, his gaze was fixed on me, and I could tell that this meal was more than just a casual lunch. Michael began talking about my future almost immediately. "You should think more about yourself," he said, his tone steady and direct. "You could achieve everything you want if you focused on your desires." His hand brushed against mine lightly as he spoke, and I maintained my composure while noting every gesture. I listened carefully to his words, aware that each compliment and each touch was part of a pattern I had observed over the past weeks. The conversation quickly shifted from casual topics to more personal ones. Michael spoke of opportunities and potential in a way that made it clear he saw me as more than just a stepdaughter. He detailed his ideas about my future, hinting that he believed I was destined for greatness if I allowed him to guide me. I responded with measured nods and brief acknowledgments, careful not to reveal any inner turmoil. Every word he spoke confirmed my suspicions about his intentions. Throughout the meal, I maintained a calm exterior while internally assessing his every move. I recalled the gifts he had given me recently and the extra attention he had been paying. These actions were not the simple expressions of care I was used to. They were calculated moves designed to influence me. Even as I accepted his compliments, I resolved not to let his behavior dictate my choices. After we finished our lunch, Michael suggested that we take a walk. It would be nice to continue our conversation in a quieter setting, he said. I agreed, though I remained cautious. The walk would give me a chance to observe him in a less formal environment and to see if his demeanor changed when we were away from the restaurant. We left the restaurant and headed to a nearby park. The park was quiet and free of distractions, offering a neutral space for our conversation. As we walked along a paved path, I kept my pace steady and my mind alert. I was focused on every small detail, each glance, each slight movement, every attempt he made to steer the conversation back to personal topics. In the park, surrounded by tall trees and the soft rustling of leaves, Michael suddenly stopped. He turned to face me directly, his eyes locked onto mine. You know, there's something more between us, he said plainly. His voice was calm and unyielding, leaving little room for ambiguity. I paused, allowing the silence to fill the space between us. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I let the silence speak. His words had shifted the dynamic, and I could feel a subtle change in the balance of power. In that moment, I recognized that I was gaining control over the situation. My silence was not a sign of submission, but a deliberate tactic to assess his next move. I thought about the past few weeks, the unexpected gifts, the lingering looks, and the overly personal compliments. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Michael's intentions were not purely about care or concern. There was an agenda behind his actions, and I was now determined to protect my autonomy. Standing there in the park, I resolved that I would not allow him to manipulate our relationship further. His statement, "You know, there's something more between us," was a clear declaration of his intent. I maintained my calm, measured silence as I considered how best to respond. I needed to let him know without words that I was not going to be easily swayed by his carefully orchestrated advances. As we continued our walk, the tension between us remained palpable. Michael made no further immediate remarks about our relationship and instead resumed walking side by side. The quiet surroundings made every step feel significant, and I stayed alert for any further signs of his intentions. I noticed how he occasionally glanced at me as if checking for a reaction, but I kept my expression neutral. At one point, he attempted to smooth over the tension by commenting, "I truly believe that you are meant for something extraordinary." His voice was steady, and his tone suggested that he expected agreement. I simply nodded, allowing my silence to communicate that I was listening yet not conceding to his implied offer of guidance. I was careful not to show any signs of vulnerability. The conversation in the park was brief and to the point. Michael's remarks about my future and our connection were intended to unsettle and influence me. I recognized that every word he spoke was a calculated move, and I kept my mind focused on the larger picture, maintaining control over my own life. I could sense that our relationship was entering a critical phase where each decision would have lasting consequences. In the cool air of the park, with the sound of our footsteps echoing softly, I realized that the true conflict was just beginning. The expensive wine, the carefully planned compliments, and the walk in the park were all part of a larger strategy. I was now more aware than ever of the power struggle at play. Michael's approach was becoming increasingly direct, and his control over our interactions was no longer absolute. As the walk continued, I felt that the dynamics between us were shifting. I had not allowed him to take full control during our conversation, and in doing so, I began to reclaim the power that he was trying to seize. Every pause, every measured word from him served as a reminder that this was a battle of wills. I was prepared to challenge his advances, even if that meant risking further confrontation. When we finally reached a small clearing, the conversation naturally came to a pause. Michael's earlier statement still hung in the air. "You know, there's something more between us," he had said, and I had responded only with silence. In that silence, I felt a change. It was as if by not immediately accepting his proposition, I had shifted the balance. I was now the one who controlled the pace and direction of our interaction. I looked directly at him, maintaining eye contact without offering any words. My silence was a clear message. I was not ready to let him dictate our relationship. I was determined to observe and decide on my own terms. The power struggle was far from over, and I knew that every moment from now on would be crucial in defining what came next. As we prepared to leave the park, the tension between us was evident. The day had been filled with subtle challenges and shifts in control, and I was fully aware that this was only the beginning. Michael's carefully measured behavior had revealed his true intentions, and I had responded by asserting my own boundaries. My resolve was clear. I would not allow his influence to override my own decisions. The events of the day had deepened the conflict between us, and I left the park with a strong sense of purpose, knowing that the stakes were rising. The quiet moments, the measured words, and the deliberate silences had all contributed to a turning point in our relationship. I was now more determined than ever to protect my autonomy and steer the situation in a direction that served my interests. In that moment, I silently vowed that I would not let this dangerous game continue unchecked. Every word, every gesture from Michael was now under my scrutiny. The next steps in our interaction would determine the course of our future, and I was ready to challenge him to assert my own will and to ensure that I remained in control. You can be sure that what comes next will be even more intense. The tension is building, and the real conflict is just beginning. After our conversation in the park, I believed I had gained some control over the situation. However, Michael's behavior only grew more intrusive over the following days. His persistence became increasingly obvious as he began showing up in places I never expected him to be. One afternoon, while I was at the gym for my regular workout, I noticed his car parked near the entrance. I wasn't expecting to see him there, and the sight made me pause. Later, as I was leaving, Michael approached me. "I was driving by and thought I'd give you a lift," he said in a casual tone. Although his words were friendly, I detected a strange tenderness in his gaze. His remark did little to ease my unease. It only confirmed that his presence was no coincidence. A few days after the gym encounter, Michael invited me to his office. "This is just for you, see how I work," he explained. When I arrived, I agreed to go, though I remained cautious about his intentions. His office was large and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed a view of the city. The space was neat, and everything was arranged in an orderly fashion. I took a seat next to him at his desk as he began showing me his projects. At first, he discussed work-related matters in a straightforward manner, outlining various projects and plans. However, as the meeting progressed, his focus shifted away from business. He leaned in closer and, in a quiet voice, said, "You are the only one who understands me." I maintained a neutral expression while processing his words. His comment was direct and personal, blurring the lines between a professional conversation and a personal intrusion. That encounter marked a turning point. I had noticed a pattern in his behavior over the past few weeks: the unexpected gifts, the overly personal compliments, and now these planned meetings that clearly had a different agenda. It became apparent that Michael was no longer just acting as a concerned stepfather. Instead, he was making deliberate moves to assert control over our interactions. In the days that followed, I began to notice Michael's presence in other unexpected settings. Whether I was shopping or attending a social event, I found him appearing at moments when I least anticipated it. Each time, he would approach me with a calm, measured demeanor, often steering the conversation toward personal matters. Despite my efforts to maintain clear boundaries, his calculated compliments and subtle gestures continued to erode the distance I tried to keep between us. The tension between us steadily increased as Michael's attempts to connect on a personal level became more overt. I recognized that each encounter was designed to unsettle me, to blur the clear lines that should have existed between us. Every time he made an unexpected appearance, I took note of his words and actions, determined to understand his true intentions. I began to see our interactions as a series of calculated moves in a power struggle, a dangerous game in which I could not afford to be a passive participant. One evening, while I was at home and my mother was present, Michael took another unexpected step after the household had quieted down. I found a small note tucked away in my room. The note was brief and to the point. It read, "We need to talk alone. Don't make me wait." Holding the note in my hand, I immediately understood the implication. Michael was pushing for another stage in his approach, and he expected my compliance without delay. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the events of the past few days, the encounters at the gym, the visit to his office, and now this note. They all painted a clear picture. Michael's intentions were shifting toward a more aggressive, manipulative strategy. His actions were no longer incidental. They were part of a deliberate campaign to control our relationship. I realized that I needed to act before his influence escalated any further. I resolved that it was time to change my role in this dangerous game. No longer would I allow myself to be merely reactive to his advances. Instead, I would take a more active stance. Every encounter, every carefully planned gesture on his part was a move that I intended to counter. I knew that I had to remain vigilant and observant, using his own tactics against him when the opportunity arose. It was clear that if I did not establish firm boundaries, I risked losing control of my own life. As I composed myself that evening, I acknowledged the complexity of the situation. My mother's presence in the house added another layer of difficulty. I needed to ensure that nothing I did would inadvertently involve her in a conflict that was strictly between Michael and me. The note was a direct challenge, and I understood that my response would set the tone for all our future interactions. I placed the note aside and reflected on my next steps. Michael's insistence was not simply a matter of personal interest. It was a calculated attempt to blur the lines of our relationship and assert dominance. I decided that I would not let him dictate the terms of our interactions any longer. My plan was to observe carefully and respond strategically. I would use the information I had gathered about his behavior to protect my autonomy and assert my own will. By the end of that evening, it was clear that Michael's tactics had moved beyond mere attention. His behavior was now a deliberate effort to control and influence me, and I recognized that I needed to counter his moves, with the note in hand and my resolve firm. That evening, as I tried to keep control over our increasingly complicated dynamic, Michael called with an invitation to a concert. "This will be unforgettable," he said, and despite my reservations, I agreed to go. I knew my decision would raise questions, especially since my mother had already expressed suspicion about how much time Michael was spending with me. Before the concert, while I was preparing to leave, my mother pulled me aside. "Why does he spend so much time with you?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. I offered a brief explanation, assuring her it was nothing more than a friendly outing. Her eyes remained doubtful, but I did not press further. I needed to see for myself where the night would lead. At the concert venue, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The crowd buzzed with excitement as the lights dimmed and the band took the stage, yet I couldn't help but notice that Michael seemed off his usual self. He appeared slightly nervous, his hands fidgeting, and his gaze occasionally drifting away from the performance. Even so, he worked hard to project confidence, offering a tight smile whenever our eyes met. Throughout the performance, I kept a careful watch on him. His occasional anxious glances and restless movements were not lost on me. While he tried to immerse himself in the music, I sensed that his mind was occupied with thoughts about us, our interactions, his intentions, and the boundaries he was beginning to blur. I maintained a neutral expression, aware that any visible reaction might give him an advantage. After the final song ended, Michael suggested we continue the evening with a drink at a nearby bar. "Let's go for a drink," he said as we left the venue together. The idea of a quieter setting appealed to me, offering a chance for a more private conversation away from the crowded noise of the concert hall. At the bar, we found a small table in a secluded corner. The lighting was low, and a soft murmur of conversation filled the background. Once we were seated, Michael ordered a drink for each of us. As we waited, he leaned forward and said, "You know, I'm ready to do anything for you." His voice was calm, and as he spoke, his hand reached out to touch mine on the table. I pretended to be a little embarrassed by the gesture, even though, inside, I was intrigued by the uncertainty I saw in his eyes. I decided to push the conversation further, testing the boundaries he was trying to set. With a playful smile, I asked, "Why do you always stop halfway, Michael?" My tone was light but deliberate, designed to prompt him to explain himself further. For a moment, he averted his eyes, and I saw a flash of discomfort cross his face, a brief hesitation that confirmed my suspicions that my question had struck a nerve. Then, almost unexpectedly, he looked back at me and replied in a quiet voice, "Because I'm afraid of losing you." His words were simple and direct, lacking the usual bravado he often tried to project. In that instant, I recognized the vulnerability in his admission, the very weakness I had been anticipating. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. I let the moment linger, processing the implications of his confession. It was clear that Michael's fear was not merely an offhand comment, but a significant admission that complicated our relationship further. It signified that his actions were driven not only by a desire to control, but also by a deep-seated insecurity. I took a measured breath and responded, "It seems fear can make us act in ways we might not fully understand." My words were chosen carefully, aiming to steer the conversation into safer territory while still acknowledging the gravity of his admission. I needed to assert that I would not allow his vulnerabilities to manipulate the dynamics between us. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes turning to the drink in front of him. The conversation had shifted the atmosphere at our table, marking a turning point in the power struggle that had defined our interactions until now. Every word, every gesture was now charged with an unspoken conflict that neither of us could ignore. In that quiet moment at the bar, I understood that our relationship was evolving into something far more complex. Michael's admission of fear was both a sign of his human vulnerability and a calculated move in our dangerous game. I resolved then that I would maintain control over my own decisions and not let his emotions dictate the course of our interactions. As the evening wore on, I remained alert, knowing that the next steps in our relationship would be crucial. I left the bar with a clear understanding. The stakes were rising, and the power dynamic between us was shifting. Michael's carefully guarded facade had begun to crack, and I was determined to steer this situation on my own terms. That night ended, leaving me to contemplate the implications of his confession. I knew that what happened next would only intensify the conflict between us, a conflict that was now heading toward its inevitable climax. The next evening, we found ourselves alone at home once again. I chose the tight dress he loved, a decision that was both calculated and risky. As I descended the stairs, I saw Michael waiting in the living room. He held a glass of wine in one hand and wore an expression that was a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The room was dimly lit, and the silence between us felt heavy with the weight of our unspoken history. When I sat down next to him, he broke the silence with a question. "You know what you're doing to me?" he asked in a low, measured tone. His hand reached out and touched my shoulder. This time, I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked up at him, my eyes searching his, and replied, "Are you sure you want this?" My voice was steady and deliberate, every word intended to make him pause and consider his next move. Michael leaned in closer until I could feel his breath on my face. Slowly, his hand slid down from my shoulder to rest on my waist. In that moment, the only sounds in the room were our measured breaths. "I can't hold back any longer," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I felt his touch, a familiar gesture that had become increasingly charged with meaning over recent weeks. It was the culmination of everything: his persistent advances, the calculated compliments, and the numerous ways he had tried to assert control over our encounters. I allowed him to touch me, but as his hand lingered, I suddenly withdrew. My mind was clear. Trust needed to be earned, and I wouldn't let him assume control without proving he was worthy. I met his eyes directly and said, "Michael, you have to prove that I can trust you," my tone firm, leaving little room for misinterpretation. His face betrayed a flash of confusion, and he started to offer explanations, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to justify his actions. But before he could continue, the front door swung open abruptly. My mother stood there, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on here?" she exclaimed, her voice rising in alarm. The sudden intrusion broke the fragile tension in the room. Michael stumbled over his words, trying to explain himself, but I raised my glass of wine and interjected, "Michael, I thought you were stronger." My words were blunt, stripping away any pretense of affection or concern he had tried to mask. My mother's reaction was immediate and decisive. Without a moment's hesitation, she turned to Michael and ordered him to leave. "Get out now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Michael tried to protest, his explanations falling on deaf ears. As my mother's disapproval filled the room, I watched as he gathered his things, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the confrontation. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly that night. As the door closed behind him, a profound silence settled over the living room. I stood there, holding my glass of wine, feeling an unexpected surge of triumph. In that moment, I realized that I had been playing a dangerous game, one where every move had been calculated and every gesture had a hidden agenda. I had managed to outmaneuver him at his own game, and now, for the first time, all the power was mine. The events of the evening replayed in my mind with unnerving clarity. I had spent weeks carefully observing Michael's behavior, the extra attention, the subtle compliments, the orchestrated encounters that all pointed toward his attempt to control our relationship. Each move he made had been a test of boundaries, a challenge to my autonomy, and now, with my mother's unexpected intervention, the final act of his manipulation had been exposed. Despite the intensity of the confrontation, I maintained my composure. I knew that this was a turning point. Michael's admission of weakness, his fear of losing me, had been the linchpin of his entire strategy. By demanding proof of trust, I had forced him into a corner, exposing the vulnerability he had tried so hard to conceal behind a facade of confidence. My mother's presence had added an unforeseen twist, one that completely undermined Michael's carefully built narrative. She had not been part of his plan, and her intervention made it impossible for him to continue his manipulative tactics without facing immediate consequences. I felt a sense of relief mixed with a quiet determination. I had always known that his intentions were not purely benevolent, and now it was clear he had overstepped every boundary. The confrontation left no room for ambiguity. My mother's disapproval and Michael's evident retreat confirmed what I had suspected all along. This relationship was a battle for power, and I had finally taken control. The game, as dangerous as it had been, was coming to an end, and while the consequences of that evening's events were still unfolding, one thing was certain: I would not allow myself to be manipulated or controlled any longer. I took a long sip of my wine, letting the taste ground me in the reality of the situation. The finality of the moment was palpable, yet it also carried the promise of a new beginning, a chance to redefine the rules and reclaim my own agency. As I stood there in the quiet aftermath, I realized that the power had shifted irrevocably. The dangerous dance we had been engaged in was over, and I was now the one calling the shots. That evening, marked by confrontation and unexpected turns, had reached its climax. I had faced the challenge head-on, and in doing so, I had emerged victorious. What comes next is uncertain, but one thing remains clear: I will no longer be at the mercy of someone else's control.